The Legend of Zelda is a series in which I think you would be hard-pressed to find a truly bad game. And yet, I have heard that the second game in the series fits that bill. It seems strange to see a direct sequel be that way, but just by looking at it, you can tell that it is a very different game from the original. But, does that mean it is a bad game? No. Not in the slightest. A game should stand on its own merits, and this is no exception. And to be honest, who even hates this anyways? I don't know a single person who can honestly say that it is a bad game if they've ever played it before. On top of that, most people who talk about how bad it is normally say something like, "Many people say this is a bad game, but I like it." But what do I think? Well, let's find out. I'm Ennis, and this is my retrospective of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. So, as we begin, I just have to soak in that opening music. As it plays, the game treats me to a story about a sleeping Princess Zelda, and how I can awaken her with the third piece of the Triforce. After that, I set up my save file, and I'm plopped right in front of the sleeping Princess Zelda. So unlike the original, Zelda 2 starts out by showing you just what you are fighting for. So before we continue on, I should go over my history with this game a little bit. I have played it, but I've never actually beaten it before. I would say I've probably gotten about halfway to the end, based on how many palaces are in the game. Because of this, I already know some of the important details. For starters, what is easily the biggest change is that, while the overworld is still an overhead view like the original, all fights, towns, and temples in this game are from a side-scrolling perspective. I will probably be talking about that later on in the retrospective, though. The second biggest change in the game is that there is now an experience system, and you can level up Link in 3 separate attributes: Strength, Magic, and Life. Because I don't want to head for the first palace completely weak, the first thing I do is I go fight some bits and bots. And yes, according to Zelda Dungeon, that is what these blobs are called. I always just call them blobs. The issue with the bits and bots, though, is that they only give out 2 experience points each. On top of that, whenever they drop something like a magic potion, they don't give any experience at all. Thankfully, though, that's offset a bit, because they can also drop P-bags, which from them give about 50 experience points. Eventually, I leveled up a few times, had my strength at level 2 and my life at level 3. I felt comfortable enough with this to take on the palace, but before that, I want to go to the nearby town to collect the magic that's there. Or so I thought. Apparently, there is no one who teaches magic in the town of Rauru. Oh well, moving on, I go through the dark cave to the Parappa Palace, only taking a detour to grab a heart container. Then, go right into the palace. And can I just say, listen to this music right now? That theme is just so good. I know I didn't mention the music in my retrospective of the original game, but that was because the music in the entire series is great. And while the music from the original is definitely iconic, I only really want to talk about music that I feel is amazing. And things like the title theme and the palace theme in this game are just so good. Oh, I should note, I might like the palace theme as much as I do because it's one of the songs played on my favorite Smash Bros. Stage, Hyrule Temple. But that aside, the palace itself. In terms of design, Parappa Palace is nothing special, but the enemies in there are. So to start off, there are a ton of Wosu. In fact, they keep spawning from the sides of the screen. These are my least favorite enemies, not because they are hard to deal with, no, but because when they touch you, not only do you lose health, but you also lose experience, so it really feels demoralizing after being hit by them. Then there are some Stalfos. They require a bit of strategy, but ultimately work as a good enemy for the first dungeon. The Guma are also decent enemies for the first dungeon as well. You have to keep a watch for an opening as they throw a ton of maces at you. But if you can get in there, you can wreck them. And that just leaves the Iron Knuckle, who I honestly don't think should be in this first dungeon. He is the equivalent of the Darknut from the first game, a very powerful enemy clad in armor, and should probably have been saved for a later part of the game. But he isn't, and I keep dying from the Iron Knuckles in this dungeon, which actually introduces another new mechanic to this game, the lives system. You run out of health, you lose a life, you go back to the beginning of the room. You run out of lives, you start back at the beginning of the game, which honestly a lot of people complain about. Personally, I don't mind that, although this is the very start of it, so we'll see how it is later on. But the thing I hate about losing all your lives is that you lose all the experience points that you have not yet spent, and start with 0 again. Thankfully, you do keep the levels you have though, but it's still annoying to start off with 0 experience again. Before I go back to the palace though, I'm going to need to do a little grinding. So I grind up a few levels. Because the XP cost for it was low, I decided to put some levels into magic. Though in hindsight, since I can't use spells, I probably shouldn't have. There'll be plenty of time for that later. Once all my stats are level 3 though, I decided to head back to Parappa Palace. Now, I'm reliably able to take down the Iron Knuckles, most of the time, and was able to get the candle this time, and even get to the Horsehead boss. Mazura. And he just towers over me. I try to land some good hits on Mazura, but ultimately, he kills me. At this point, I want to go for a change of strategy. If I remember correctly, the first spell in the game is Shield, and because I can't get in Rauru, I go to the only other town in the area that's a bit to the west, Ruto. There, I meet a woman who is looking for a lost trophy. I leave the town and head for a cave on the beach. After getting the end, I find the trophy, and it kind of looks more like an angel than a trophy. Anyways, I collect it, I head back to the woman, and go speak with her uncle. Her uncle teaches me how to use the spell Jump. That was not what I thought it was going to be. I'm wondering if I was wrong about Rauru, and head back there. Lo and behold, I find a woman who tells me to speak with her father inside the house. So I go speak to him, and he does give me the shield spell. With the spell shield, I'm able to tank enough hits while facing off against Mazuru, and because of that, I am able to kill him this time. I go to the next room, place the crystal in the statue, and leave the palace as it crumbles behind me. Having beaten the first palace, I head through a cave that leads me to Midoro Swamp. I go a little further into Midoro Swamp and find the town of Saria. In this town, a woman is looking for her lost mirror. Apparently, she lent it to her friend because it's under the table in a house in another part of the town. Or at least that's my headcanon that she lent it to a friend. I return to her with the mirror and go into her house to meet the wise man of Saria, who teaches me how to use the spell Life. And that is one of the most useful spells in the game, because it can heal you. Well, at least that's my opinion of it anyways. At this point, after I get my strength to level 4, I leave the town area and head for Midoro Palace. It's actually kind of annoying to get there though, because you have to trek through a bunch of swamp tiles which slow you down a lot. When I finally do arrive at Midoro Palace, I get to work. In here, I find a close contender to be my least favorite enemy, the Ra. They look like floating horse heads, but apparently they're dragon heads. Well, whatever they are, they move in a pattern that is just very annoying. I also find ropes, which now just shoot at me like Octoroks do. Honestly, I think they should have rushed you, that way it'd be like the original game, but it's not that big a deal. They aren't hard to take out in the least. Eventually though, I come across a red iron knuckle, which is more powerful than the ones I fought in Parappa Palace. Considering I thought that they should not have even put the standard iron knuckles into the first dungeon, I'm definitely against a stronger version just one dungeon later. But yeah, long story short, it kills me, and because I am out of lives, I start back at Zelda's temple. Since I have to start back at the beginning, I remember something said by someone in Ruto. Find magic in a cave south of the castle. Assuming he means Zelda's palace, I leave and find a cave right out of sight of the palace. I go in and get a magic container, which should help me back at Midoro Palace. With that in mind, I head back there. Now, earlier I was saying that the Ras make number 2 on my least favorite enemy list. Yeah, they kind of bumped themselves up to number 1 after I realized that they also steal experience from you. Anyways, this palace is definitely more complex than the first one. There is even a place with blocks that prevent you from moving on until you find the dungeon item. Speaking of the item, in this dungeon, it's the Power Glove. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad. Well, actually it isn't the Power Glove. It's actually called the Handy Glove. When I found out about that, I thought it was a huge missed opportunity to call it the Power Glove. Though, saying that, I did look into it right after and found out that the Power Glove didn't come out until a year after Zelda 2. Didn't even exist for the North American release, so I guess I really have no choice but to let it slide. Still though, what could have been. But I'm getting sidetracked. I get the Handy Glove, and with it I'm able to break the blocks I was talking about earlier. After a gauntlet of some strong enemies, I finally make it to Germafencer, the boss of Midoro Palace. I gotta say, I kind of enjoyed this fight. I like how after hitting him the first few times, his helmets are also attacking you. I will say though, it is kind of strange that he attacks with projectiles. I mean, Fencer is in his name, and he is carrying that kick-ass sword. He should totally be using it to fight me. Oh well though, either way, I'm able to take him down with barely a sliver of health left. I then go place the second crystal into the second statue, and walk out as the second palace crumbles. At this point, because I'm so close to leveling up my strength, I grind by the town of Saria until I get my strength to level 5. Though after this, I'm kind of lost. I have a feeling I need to get across the river to continue, but I don't know how. I talk to just about everyone in Saria, and finally speak to a purple blob. I keep annoying it while it's trying to sleep until it tells me that Master is in woods north of river. Right now, that's really my only hint to go on, so I take a walk on several of the forest tiles north of the river until I finally find a cabin. In the cabin is Bagu, and he tells me to show his note to the riverman. With the note, I go back to Saria, speak to the man in the house by the river, and he creates a bridge for me. After crossing, I arrive at Death Mountain. At first I'm thinking that it doesn't exactly live up to its name, but then I go in deeper. I learn just how appropriate the name is as Agoria kills me with its boomerang. I decide to try again, though this time I treat it differently. I go old school, and I make a map, and even make it to the end of Death Mountain this time. I go into a cave down there, and this cave looks pretty nice actually. I'm betting there is something in here. Doesn't do me much good though, as a Daira comes up and kills me. Because of this, I decided to do a bit of grinding, specifically for magic and life. With those two leveled up, I go back and do that nice cave. After exploring, I finally find a hammer. Back outside the cave, I use the hammer to break the rock right there. I go into the block that the rock was on, and I find a magic container. Awesome! After that, I'm able to find the harbor town of Mido. I talk to as many inhabitants as I can. One man tells me to talk to Error in order to find out information about the palace. A random kid on the street tells me that there is a palace to the south with a raft. There is an open door at what looks like a church, but I can't get up to it, even when I try the jump spell. And lastly, there's an old woman with a sick daughter. I have no idea what to do for her. I leave the town and go back to Ruto, though I do use the hammer to make shortcuts on my way there. I'm not going back the long way, no way. While in Ruto, I go and meet up with Error, who tells me of a tunnel south of King's Tomb in the graveyard. I head back to the Mido area and go into the graveyard. While there, I find a lone gravestone and walk into it. A woman tells me that this is King's Tomb. I leave and go south and fall into the tunnel. I would be happy about this, but there's a large vertical wall that I can't pass, even with the jump spell. I'm almost positive I need the fairy spell at this moment, and my best hope is to find that spell with the old woman and the sick daughter. I go back to town. Nobody gives me any information on how I can help the old lady's daughter. While I'm here, I try the church again. This time, though, I give it a running start using my jump spell, and this time I'm actually able to get in. In there, I meet a man who teaches me the downward thrust. This is going to be fun. At this point, though, I'm actually kind of lost, so I decided to call it for the time being. Coming back in, I have a confession to make. I have no idea where I can get something to help the old lady's daughter, so at this point, for the first time in the playthrough, I go to Zelda Dungeon to use their guide. And no, I do not count getting enemy names using their guide. Yes, it's using the resources, but not their guide. But thanks to that, I managed to find a breakable rock in front of a cave I missed. Deep within the cave is none other than a bottle of blood. Okay, it's actually the water of life. I take it to the old lady in Mido and meet with someone in her basement who teaches me the fairy spell. All I can say about the fairy spell is that I am not a fan. I'm constantly accidentally using the spell, which I will admit is my fault, but the fact that you don't turn back until after you leave the screen is crazy, and can get really annoying sometimes. It should have allowed you to turn off the spell at any time. But whatever, with Fairy, I'm able to make my way through the secret cave and get to the island with the next palace on it. Once in, I discover a new enemy that throws maces at Link. The Doom Knocker. And damn is he tough. One hit almost takes a full block of life from me, which is a lot considering I'm at level 7 life right now. Continuing through though, at the other end of the first basement level of the palace, I find the outside. It doesn't really affect much, but it was a nice change of scenery, and it really does add to this palace. It's also out here where I die for the first time in the palace. To an iron knuckle, no less. And have to start back at Zelda's palace again. I think I talked about not hating this before. Yeah, I was an idiot then. Getting to this temple is annoying enough, even with the hammer. And I can only imagine it will get worse as I get to later palaces. Saying that though, I think this might be the first appropriate place to see the Iron Knuckle. Though, the weaker version would have been better here. And I am definitely not a fan of the blue knife-throwing Iron Knuckle. There's only one standard version in the palace, but it is annoyingly placed in a way that you can't expect to move forward until you beat it. Unless, of course, you want a bunch of knives in the back while fighting another Iron Knuckle. Beyond that, I die a lot in this palace. And only one of those times was not to an Iron Knuckle. That time was actually very embarrassing. I died to a blob. Bot. Well, kind of. It pushed me into a pit. Not the brightest moment of this playthrough. As for the palace itself, I have to say, it makes very good use of the handy glove and the downward thrust. Between all of the blocks that need to be destroyed, as well as the Mew, which might as well be moving spike traps, and then just the part that is outside, I think this palace might be the best so far. Eventually, I made it to the boss. It is an iron knuckle on a horse, and it is called Rebanak. The only way to deal damage to him is by jumping and using the downward thrust on him, at least until he falls off his horse. At this point, he's a normal blue iron knuckle who throws knives at you. At this point, he's kind of annoying, not because he's an iron knuckle, but because he is constantly backing away from you and can even go off the screen. He actually almost killed me with this until I decided to see if I could cheese it and spam the downward thrust on him. I was actually surprised it worked. But with it, I was able to beat Rebanak. Place the crystal in the statue. And walk away as the third palace collapses behind me. Once back on the mainland, I use my new raft at the docks of the harbor town of Mido and cross the ocean where I find the town of Nibiru. At this point, I want to say I think I have officially gotten further than I have ever gotten in this game, because I don't ever remember using the raft before. At this town, I meet a nutter who thinks that just by putting on a pair of boots, it would allow him to walk on water. I honestly don't want to be the one who tells him that clothes don't work that way. I also meet a girl who is thirsty, and oh my god, the solution to this should be a joke. I get some water from the fountain only a few yards away from her house, bring it back to her, and she invites me into her house. I've been ignoring the joke about the lady who heals you, but my god, between the innuendo involved and just how little you need to solve this, why? Hell, the requirement to get the spell from this town is easier than the requirements to get the spell in Ruto. In more ways than one. And that's saying something. Whatever though. I go inside and get the fire spell, which is actually very fun to use. Beyond her, I talk to everyone else to get some hints for the future. I get some interesting information, but I don't think I can use any of it yet. I next go to the cave north of Nibiru, and just explore the area until I found the mountain town of Darunia. Oh my god, finally the name matches! I've been going to save this for the ending, but the names of the sages in Ocarina of Time are the same as a lot of the names of these towns. I knew that going in, but As I've been discovering these towns, their name have been annoying me because they're not matching up with the names from the sages from Ocarina of Time. For example, there's the water town of Saria. Saria becomes the forest sage in Ocarina of Time. And the water sage Ruto, she just has the town of Ruto. I know it's not the game's fault. I mean, it couldn't be. The game was released 11 years before Ocarina even came out. I just wish they named the sages with a little more consistency than that. But sidetrack aside, I think Darunia gets the love he should, seeing as the Goron are tied explicitly to the mountains. While exploring the town of Darunia, I meet an old lady who tells me that there was a child kidnapped from the town and brought to an island. So I take it this is where the spell house is, and I just need to rescue the child first. I also noticed that a ton of houses have chimneys while exploring. I use my jump spell to get on top of the houses until I finally find one that lets me act like it's Christmas and go down the chimney. In the house is a knight who teaches me the upward thrust. At this point, I decide to call it quits. Once I get back, I'll see what else I can do. Back in, one of the first things I do is die to a bubble. Yes, a bubble. Whatever. I next go back to the other landmass and start searching places I haven't been to yet. I go across a bridge, and on the other side I find a maze. While exploring it, I manage to find the missing child and... oh my god. I know everyone talks about this, but this is freaking hilarious. Anyways, after that, I go back to the correctly classified mountain town of Darunia, and return the child to the old lady. In her house, I get the Reflect spell. At this point, I feel like I want to grind a little. I go back to Namburu, where I find a good place to grind until I get my stats to level 7. And honestly, I gotta say, it's actually a very good grinding spot. After I finish grinding, I go back to the island maze, since I've seen a palace there. While in the palace, I discovered just how evil the Ra are. Not only do they take away experience, but they were also placed in locations with collapsing bridges, which makes it very easy for them to knock you into bottomless pits. As for new enemies in this palace, well, there's really only one major new enemy, and that's the Wizrobes. They aren't overly complex, just throw up a reflect spell and hit their spells back at them. As for the palace itself, the interesting gimmick in this place is that this time there are some pits that drop you to the floor below you. I'm actually not sure how I feel about this. Lucky for me, I discovered it by accident as I failed to jump a gap. But there are actually parts where it is actually required to fall down. Especially if you get stuck beyond a part like this and don't have enough magic to use the fairy spell. I could easily see people getting stuck here. As for the palace item this time, it's a pair of boots. They let me walk on water. I think I owe someone an apology. Kidding aside, there isn't much left to talk about except for the boss. In this palace, it's a super Riz robe called Karak. As far as I can tell, the only way to beat him is to reflect his spell back at him. I try to do this from the center of the screen, but he keeps sneaking up behind me. Eventually, I decided to go to the left side of the screen and see what happens when I don't even have to turn around. I swear to God, I didn't even move an inch from that spot, and I'm able to bring Karak down because of it. I now put the crystal in the statue, and this time I'm actually surprised that the palace crumbled, considering I feel like I actually left some doors locked. But maybe that stuff just doesn't count towards beating the palace. At this point now, I have actually found what I believe to be the next palace out in the water to the east of Namburu. But I tried to use the boots to get there, but the world blocks me from getting close to the island, even with the boots. So I decided to grind for a half hour, because I honestly couldn't figure out how to get to the island. And I got to the max level in all my stats. At this point, there's absolutely nothing else to do now that I've leveled up fully, so I try something that I think I've tried before, but apparently I didn't because it worked. I followed the path leading east out of Namburu, and once I hit the water, I just continued. And eventually I got to the Island Palace. So this temple introduces the Lame Wizrobes, otherwise known as the Mago. They're very pointless. They teleport around the room, but only shoot a small fire a few feet in front of themselves. It is very easy to dodge their attacks. On top of that, they don't stick around long enough to be able to hit them fast enough, and ironically enough, the times I did get hit from them was when I was trying to jump in and hit them. Well, that and the few times that they spawned on top of me. As for the palace itself, let me get back to you on that. You see, in this palace, I was actually able to get to the boss before I got the item. And while I don't inherently find that bad, in this case I actually do. But I'll get back to that in a moment. For this temple, the boss is this big brute right here, Guma. And he attacks by throwing a large pike ball and chain at you. I wonder if this guy's related to the Dark Hammer from Twilight Princess. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyways, I kill Guma, place the crystal in the statue, and leave the palace. And then go right back in. And I eventually do find the item of the temple. It's the flute. But I'm really not a fan of how I got to the item this time. In this temple, one of the gimmicks is that you actually need to walk through what looks like solid wall. I don't have an issue with this in theory, and if the temple was designed so that if you didn't reach the boss until after you walked through the fake wall, I actually wouldn't have any issues with this at all. But the fact that you can get to and defeat the boss of the temple without going through any fake wall implies that there's nothing like a fake wall there. In fact, the only reason I knew about the fake wall was because I've seen videos that mention it, so I knew at some point during this game I was going to have to do that. It might sound like I'm pretty annoyed at this temple, but I definitely have to say, my issues with it are not nearly as bad as my issues with Dungeon 7 from the original game. That dungeon just sucked. Anyways, once out of the temple, I go and use the flute on this spider pig thing? Apparently it is the River Devil. Yeah, I don't see it. Anyways, after that, I go through a really annoying pass that I'm calling the Rock-Throwing Lizifos Pass. It's more annoying than hard, really. Soon after I get through that, though, I die and decide to call it quits for the time being. So, back into the thick of things. I get through the Rock-Throwing Lizifos Pass, cross the bridges in the area, and get to the town of Katsuo. According to the sign, the town is deserted. That's kind of a strange thing for a sign to say. But despite the fact that the town is deserted, I managed to find an old man in the basement of a house who tells me that I should be looking in the woods to the east of the town. Problem is, I try that, and there is no woods directly east. So I try the woods a bit above the east of town, and honestly I find nothing. I even go through a cave to look for it, and at the other end, there is absolutely nothing. I went through every piece of woods there. Although I did notice a strange rock formation soon after I left the town. I went to the center of it and played my flute, and it actually brought up the next temple. Unfortunately, I kind of ran into a dead end in there, so I have to leave. During all that time, though, I managed to get a few game overs, and I had to trek all the way back here. I know I can use save states to mitigate the issues getting here, but I promised myself that I would only be using them for saving my game, and otherwise would be experiencing the game like people did in the 80s. Anyways, with nowhere else I can think of to go, I go through the graveyard. And on the other side, I go through another mountain pass. And I have to say, absolutely nothing killed me. Hell, nothing even hurt me. And no, I'm not talking about how good I am doing in here. I mean that there is literally nothing on the screen, and all of a sudden, I get hurt. And it kills me. So in other words, literally nothing hurt me. At this point, I'm getting extremely frustrated having to come back here each time I die while making no progress at all. So I decided to call it and pull up a guide on Zelda Dungeon. I did not like what I found. In this area here after the caves, there is a hidden town. How do you find the town? You use your hammer on it, aka the thing you haven't used since the first landmass. Why in Hyrule would it ever be reasonable to do that? Whatever. I get in and find the hidden town of Kasuo. In other words, the location where the other town fled to. And actually, this town is very good to me. In an old lady's house I find a magic container. An old man teaches me the spell, and with the spell, I am able to find the magical key. So, I never have to worry about locked doors again. After that, and still using a little help from the guide at Zelda Dungeon, I search the beach until I find a location with a heart container in it. The last thing I decide to do before going to the Hidden Palace by the rocks is to go back to the destroyed town of Kasuo, since a person in the hidden village of the town said the old man is still there and will teach me magic. And he teaches me the Thunder Spell. So with that all done, I head for the palace. Honestly, I don't have too much to say about this palace. We don't get any new significant enemies. The palace is split up into multiple parts where you have to fall into holes in the ground. But at this point that's become expected. And you reach a dead end long before it gets frustrating. So, exhausting all of their ideas, at this point it actually makes sense to drop down. Beyond that, I absolutely hate the long hallway with the Ra in it. They keep pushing me into death pits. I will say one thing that is interesting about this palace though, in order to get the item, you have to face off against Ribanak again. Saying that, he is kind of a pushover. But speaking of the palace item, it's a cross. Weird. I kind of thought Nintendo tried to stay away from religious imagery during this era. Apparently, it reveals the enemies that have been killing me in certain areas because they've been invisible. Beyond that, I finally get to the boss room and have to face off against the Dragon Barba. And I will say, he was probably the easiest boss to beat. On my second attempt. Anyways, I beat him, put the crystal into the statue, and walked away as the palace crumbled behind me. All that's left now is the Great Palace. Though I will make one more detour first. So before we continue, I go to Zelda Dungeon one last time to find where the last heart container is. And I go pick it up, and then head out on my way to the Great Palace. The road to it, however, is complete and utter bullshit. Oh my god, apparently this area is called the Valley of Death. Instead, it should either be called the Valley of Cheap Deaths or the Valley of Dead Links, with how many bodies I'm littering behind me. Between the start of the area and the Great Palace, there are tons of death pits. Not to mention, if you get into random encounters, you have to deal with even more. And above the death pits are a bunch of Moa circling around, trying to knock you in. I was at this for over an hour, dying and starting back at the beginning, trekking back just to be pushed into pits over and over again. It was not a good frustration, oh no. In fact, it was such a bad frustration that I decided to do what I swore I would not do. I used save states in order to push myself through until I finally reached the Great Palace. So, I finally arrived at the Great Palace, and I don't know if it was the frustration of getting to the Great Palace, but I got somewhat frustrated, somewhat fast while in this palace due to getting lost and dying so many times. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This palace's gimmick is that it's just gigantic, and there are tons of tough enemies. New enemies even. First is the Fokaru. They're bird-like enemies who will shoot fire at you in high arcs. Personally, I actually kind of like these enemies. Their cousins, on the other hand, not so much. And by their cousins, I'm actually referring to the Foca. The bird-like iron knuckles, who are even harder to hit and tougher to deal with. The only saving grace about them is that they can jump, and it is actually easier to hit them with the upward thrusts when they do jump over you. Beyond that though, they were tough enemies, and were able to kill me several times. Thankfully, this palace brings you back to the beginning of the palace each time you die. Still though, I really think the Valley of Dead Links got to me, as at this point I gave up and decided to look up a video on it. I'm going to put the link to the video I found in the description. The guy playing went through the palace like it was nothing. I honestly don't know if I should be more impressed at this person's skill, or more depressed at my own lack of skill. In the end though, I'm finally able to get to the end of the palace. But before that, I actually find a use for the Ra. I'm able to grind magic potions off them, which allows me to fully heal myself, and move on with full magic. And with that, I run to the boss. Once there, I decided to use save states again. I'm at the very end of the game, and I do not want to have to go through the entire dungeon again. Anyways, the boss for the Great Palace is the Thunderbird, and I've seen enough videos on this game to know that you have to use the Thunder spell in order to damage him. So I start off with that. And he kills me. And he keeps killing me. I have noticed a pattern though. From what I can tell, he keeps throwing fireballs in the direction he is moving from. I try to use this to my advantage, but as he gets closer to death, he throws out a lot more, and he just overwhelms me. If my count is correct, he was able to kill me 16 times before I was finally able to land the killing blow on him. Still, I save again, and I go to face my dark self in the final battle for the game. I try my best, but after a few attempts, I only get him down about halfway. At this point, I decided to try the cheap way. Go to the left, crouch, and attack. As much as I did enjoy the game and wanted to beat him legit, I also want to be done with this game and move on in this series, as by the end of the game, I was a bit frustrated. But yeah, because of that, I get the Triforce of Courage, Awaken Princess Zelda, and get a kiss as the curtain falls. Well, with the game being over, there are a few things I want to talk about now. For starters, I want to talk about the biggest change from the original to this game, that being the side-scrolling battle system. In some ways, I will admit it does feel more limiting, but in other ways, I think it's actually a lot better. In the original, the main way to beat enemies was just by slashing them, and for the most part, the only strategy was either using items in a certain way, or hitting enemies from certain sides. In this game, on the other hand, because of the left-right perspective, there's a lot more detail. I felt in a lot of fights, especially against enemies like the Iron Knuckle, that I was being much more active in trying to beat my enemies, instead of just slashing a sword. The biggest downside to the side-scrolling is that the palaces are not nearly as memorable as the dungeons were in the original game. I remember the gimmicks of each palace, but I don't remember the layouts of them at all. Another big difference is that in Zelda 2: Adventure of Link, there are towns. Save for a few minor NPCs who are hiding, the original Legend of Zelda is completely barren. It doesn't feel like I was saving anybody, it just felt like I was trying to stop evil that had already wiped Hyrule off the map. In contrast, Zelda 2 has so many towns, and each town there are a ton of people in it. It feels like my actions will actually help the people in these towns, and thus it actually gave a lot more weight to what I was doing. In fact, in terms of the entire world being lived in, I think this beats out about half of the future games in the series. Though, I guess I'll find that out as I go along in this series. Now, I know I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that the names of the towns didn't match the attributes of those who they were in Ocarina of Time was actually surprisingly bothering. Now, obviously, I'm not going to hold it against this game. After all, this game came out long before Ocarina of Time. But knowing the history of it, it just kind of annoyed me. But anyways, we have finally reached the end. In the beginning of this video, I said that this game is a game that is said to be hated, but I don't know a single person who actually does hate it. But now that I've beaten it for the first time, what do I think? And do I actually think it's better than the original? Well, to start off, I have to say that I do indeed think that Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is more fun than the original. And that was mainly because of how active the combat felt compared to the original. I honestly do think that this is a great game. But this game is extremely frustrating, especially the further in you go. Between the death pits, bad enemy placement that will constantly push you into those death pits, overly strong enemies, especially in the early game, and the fact that whenever you get a game over, you go back to the beginning of the game no matter where you are, with the only exception being in the Great Palace. Add all those up, and even though I don't agree with it, I can easily see how people can call this game bad. Likewise, while I can easily say that this game is more fun than the original, it is also more frustrating than the original. And when you get those frustrating parts, there's only so much that the fun from beforehand can do for it. So yes, I do think that Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is more fun than the original Legend of Zelda, but I do not think it is a better game than the original. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. But I'm curious, have any of you played Zelda 2? If so, do you think I was spot on? If not, tell me down in the comments below. And if you liked my video, hit that like button down below there as well. And if you're interested in seeing more of this retrospective series, along with anything else I might put out, hit the subscribe button as well. Next time on this series, I'll be looking at The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. Until then, game on.